today's gonna be a little different. I wanna share with you something that I'm slightly ashamed that I love. I love those cleaning motivation videos. You know those videos where you see this person in their messy house and then you literally watch them tidy and organize on hyperspeed? Yeah, I love those videos. I love watching someone clean. I feel like it motivates me to organize and clean my own house. I find that sometimes I need motivation to do my budget, to fill out my budget, to track my expenses. And so I started thinking, why don't I make a budgeting motivation video? Hey, it's Carissa from Automate to Abundance here, and today we're talking about budgeting. I find that if I regularly track my expenses, it helps me to be more mindful about my spending. Going back through to review what I spent money on and how much I spent helps me stick to my budget because it's a regular reminder of how I'm doing. When I started budgeting, I used to just write down all of my expenses at the end of every day in the margin of a journal that I would do every single night. So at the end of the day, I would just open up that journal, and in the margins, I would write $21.62 groceries or $25.50 gas or $6.32 coffee. Whatever my expenses were for the day, I just write them down in the margin of that journal. And then every weekend, I would go and transfer all those expenses to an Excel spreadsheet and then categorize them into the different spending categories that I included in my budget. However, I have adapted how I track my expenses over time. And so now that I kind of know what I'm spending and am spending a little bit more intuitively, I feel good about tracking my expenses just twice a month. So I track them mid-month, I put them all into my Excel tracker, and then at the end of the month, I'll put the rest of the expenses for the month into that Excel tracker. It's about halfway through the month right now, so I'm gonna take you along as I track my expenses for this month. So the first thing I do when I'm about to start updating my budget, tracking my expenses, is I get all my materials together in the same place. So I have several things here that will help me to track my expenses. I have some of my receipts that I'm gonna need to put into these expense trackers, and I'll explain why I use them a little bit later. I have my spreadsheet on my computer. I also have my iPad here so that I can access all of my financial apps on a different device. I find that that just works better for me. I also have highlighters and a pen because I do some work on these receipts sometimes and might include things that are included on the same receipt in different budget categories. So I'm also gonna need a calculator, and I'll just use one of them on my iPad. So I also wanted to just show you a little bit about what this spreadsheet looks like that I use for my budget tracking or my expense tracking. Typically when I include a new expense, I add a date, I include a transaction description. That's where I'll write like the grocery store name and say that I bought groceries. And then I've created this drop-down system where there are different budget pools. So this is where you'd be able to write down what kind of budgets you have. And this is how I've just broken them down in this basic spreadsheet of just like, is this for savings? Is this for debt? Is this for housing of some kind, or a living expenses like groceries or hygiene or transportation like gas? So I'll allocate it to a certain budget pool. I'll write the amount, and then I'll include the payment method. So this is where you can add in if you have credit cards, or if you have a debit card you're using, or a check, or if you're transferring your checking account. So as soon as I add an expense over here, if I just make a fake one, and let's write groceries, and then the budget pool, it's gonna come from groceries, and I spent $32.87, and I put it on my first credit card. Then my spreadsheet dumps it over here into this chart and writes over here that I've spent $33 of my $300 budgeted on groceries, so I've spent 11% of my grocery budget. It also tells me down here how much money I've spent for each of my payment types. So because I selected the drop down for credit card 1, it puts it over here. So this is just how I choose to track my spending in this spreadsheet. This spreadsheet is something that I include as a part of my program, and so if you're interested in learning more about that, you can connect with me. But I know that I like to spend in about 4 different places. I have about 2 different banks that I use and 2 different credit cards that I use regularly. So the way that I start tracking my expenses is actually just by going into each of those systems for each of those banks or each of those credit cards and starting to track and write down the expenses in my Excel spreadsheet since the last time I tracked. Since I mentioned that this is mid-month, I'm just gonna go ahead and start tracking for everything that I've spent since the beginning of the month. So I'm gonna start with the first bank. Not much in the first bank, so I already have that one done. So I'm gonna go ahead and log into the system for my second bank and continue tracking my expenses. I'm done with the banks. Those are usually pretty quick because there's not much happening there. As much as I can put on my credit cards, I try to. So the expenses I have to record that come directly from my bank accounts are pretty minimal. The first credit card I check is probably also not gonna have a lot of expenses on it. I try to keep a couple credit cards open, but I typically use one as my primary card, and then any other cards will only have a small recurring monthly expense on them. That way I'm continuing to keep them active, but it's not a lot for me to track. So I choose the one that has the best benefits, put most of my expenses on that one, and then any other credit cards I'm using have just one small monthly recurring expense on them. All right, so I'm getting into my last credit card. This is the one that I keep most of my purchases on. And so this is the one that most of these receipts will probably also be attributed to. So I'm gonna go ahead and start entering these purchases, and then I will explain receipts as I get to them. So when I get to an expense in the system that I'm seeing that I'm not totally sure what it's for, I think stores like Walmart or Target are big ones. I don't necessarily know what I bought. If it's a grocery store, I know it's probably groceries, but stores like Walmart or Target, I'm not always, or Amazon, I'm not always totally sure what I bought. So then I will pull the receipt, and if there is multiple different budget categories included in this receipt, then I will do some work with my highlighters. So for example, this receipt for me includes some groceries, some hygiene products, and some cleaning products. And so those are things that I keep in different budget categories. I could lump them all together, but I just choose to separate them out. So what I do is I just take my receipt, I highlight the different purchases in different colors, and then I just try to do some basic math on a calculator to try to figure out roughly how much of each receipt should be allocated to each of those budget categories. I'm not trying to do like perfect math and figure out all the tax exactly. I just go in and try to figure out, okay, I spent roughly this much that I'm gonna put on a grocery line. I spent roughly this much that I'm gonna put on a cleaning supplies line. And then I'll add separate lines to my budget for each of those separate categories that I'm noticing on this receipt. I just wanted to pop on here to say, if you are enjoying learning about personal finance, I have free sessions coming up to help you learn how to automate your money so that you can use it as a tool to live your richest life. If you're interested in attending one of these free sessions, check out what I have coming up at automatetoabundance.com/workshops. So I have almost everything updated. Since this is my mid-month check-in, I'm also looking at my different spending categories to see if there are any budget categories that are over 50%. Since I'm about halfway through the month, I should probably only be at 50% of my expenses. So I'm checking to see where I'm at in some of my categories. Some categories that I'm not worried about are like rent is already at 100%. Obviously, I've already spent all my rent money for the month. But other categories I would say I am a little bit more worried about. My grocery budget is quite a bit over at this point. I'm at about 98% of my budget. I had to buy my dog, some of her canned food, which I typically buy in bulk. And so I'm very over my grocery budget currently. So I'll have to keep that in mind and see if there is some savings account, like a savings account that I have for the dog, that I can pull some of that money from to free up some money in my grocery budget. My hygiene budget is also at a little bit over 50% at this point, so I'll need to be mindful about hygiene purchases moving forward. Things I include in this category are things like shampoo and conditioner and face wash, those sorts of things, but I should be pretty set on those, so I'm not too worried about that. My cleaning supplies category is already at about 100% as well, so that's where I include things like paper towels or dish soap or cleaning spray, but all of those things as well, I feel like I have on hand enough to last me for the rest of the month, so I should be okay in that category. I haven't spent any money though in my pet care, my dog extras category, so I might transfer some of the money that I was planning to put in my grocery budget for the food budget for me and my dog. I might put some of that in this dog extras budget, that way I can free up a little bit of money in my grocery budget and finagle the numbers a little bit. You can track your expenses in lots of different ways. I just choose to track mine in the spreadsheet that I built because that works well for me, but lots of people like using an app like Mint, or you need a budget. Whatever method works for you is completely fine. So today's video was just a quick look into one way that you could choose to track your expenses. I'd be curious to hear what questions you have about budgeting or tracking your expenses. Let me know what questions you have in the comments below. Subscribe to my channel to be the first to know when I upload a new video, and if you enjoyed this one, then you need to check out this video right over here.